Today, I want to talk for a few moments from the topic, two lovers, two lovers. And the scripture for today is going to come out of the book of Job. And I'll be reading in the first chapter of Job, the 1st through the 5th verse and the 13th through the 19th verse. And it says, there was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of all of them. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 columns and made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Well, I've got 2 lovers and I ain't ashamed. 2 lovers and I love them both the same. I'll save you. Let me tell you about my first lover. He's sweet and kind. He's mine, oh mine, and treats me good like a lover should and makes me love him. I really love him. Oh, I love him so, and I'll do everything I can to let him know. But I've got 2 lovers and I ain't ashamed. 2 lovers and I love them both the same. Let me tell you about my other lover. Well, you know, he treats me bad and he makes me sad. He makes me cry, but still I can't deny, but I love him. I really love him. I love him so, and I'll do anything I can to let him know. Darling, well, don't you know I can tell that whenever I look at you, that you think that I'm untrue because I say I love 2. But I really do, because you're a split personality. And in reality, both of them are you. I saved you from my singing because, it wasn't going so well. 2 Lovers is a single released in 1962 by Mary Wells on the Motown label. It was written by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and recorded by Mary Wells. You know, people who really know me know I like music, especially old school music. But as many times as I've heard this song and thought about this song in the past, I never put it in this context, that this was how some of us live and believe in terms of our relationship to God. Our God has a split personality. On the one hand, God is sunshine, rainbows, and butterflies, loving us and sprinkling blessings in abundance on us. And as we say, being better to us than we are to ourselves, opening doors, making ways, being the source of our joy and our happiness. That's when we say God is good. But then there are other sides of life when things are just not going so well. In fact, there are times when we are just perplexed as to what God is up to. It's during those times that we start to ask why. How can God do this to me? Or how can God let this happen to me? Or does God even care about me? There are times in most of our lives when we fall into a corner of despair and or questioning when it comes to our connection with God. Even the most devout among us have our moments. And our text today comes from a story about such a man. The text for today comes out of one of the most famous books of the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Job, which bears the name of the central character in the narrative. First off, let me begin by saying this is not a true account of an actual person. It's a story that has been heard or read over the years to grapple with the topic of theodicy, which is the question of whether God is, if God is all powerful, why is there evil? And if God is love, how can there be fear and hate in the world? Is God really loving? Is God really just? One way to prove this is a narrative about a fictional protagonist in this book. It's situated in a section of the Bible called the writings. That's how we know that this is fiction, because it's in the writing section of the Bible. And although this ancient Israel story, it's not really a story birthed out of Israel. It probably came from some other legend outside of Israel. The book of Job is constructed as a long arc of prose with a pyramid of poetry in the middle of it. Chapters 1 to 2 and chapter 42 are prose, but in the middle, there's a whole lot of poetry. And it's thought that the prose part of the narrative dates around the 6th century BCE, and the poetry dates around the 4th and the 6th century BCE, which supports the argument that this is not just one author, these were multiple authors who put together the story. Most of us have heard the story of Job, a man that the text says was blameless and upright, so pious that he used to get up in the morning and offer burnt offerings on behalf of his children in case they had sinned. But the story goes, it seems like Job becomes a pawn in it's sort of a sick game between God and Satan, where Satan says he can make Job curse God. So God allows Satan to kill Job's family, including all of his children. When that was not enough, then Job was afflicted with a skin ailment that made him have boils from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. But still, even though his wife told him he should, Job still would not curse God or give up his connection to God. Even Job's friends came to comfort him, but their words provide no comfort because they provide commentary and advice that was rooted in the theological view of their day, which was that Job must have done something. He must have sinned in some kind of way to cause those kind of troubles to come his way. It must be some sort of retribution or some sort of punishment from God that was causing his misfortune. Unfortunately, it's not just a historical theological view of God. Many of us today think this way when things don't go the way we want or expect or accept. We start to wonder why. We start to wonder, does God care? We start to wonder, how could God let this happen to me? We start to think this is a reflection of something that we did and something maybe we should have done differently. But why? Why, no matter what, why would God allow this? This is a very anthropomorphic understanding of who and what God is. In many ways, it's born out of projecting our limited understanding onto a reality that we can't grasp any kind of way. I don't mean that in a disparaging kind of a way. We do the best we can with what we know. But I'm often reminded of those words that are sometimes attributed to Socrates that says, true wisdom comes to each of us when we realize how little we understand about life, ourselves, and the world around us. Whether or not Socrates ever said anything like that, it does make sense. Or as Stephen Covey put in a more succinct way, he said, we don't know what we don't know. So besides the basics, like if you touch a hot stove, you're going to get burned, or if you break the law, you may get caught, or if you don't do your job, you'll probably get fired. All those sort of things we really know if we want to admit to ourselves. We know what's going to happen in those type of situations. No, I'm laughing. I was thinking about a guy at work who told me he didn't understand why he wasn't getting promoted. He blamed race. He blamed age. He even prayed about it. He told people he was praying about it. But then he got transferred to report to me, and I got a pretty good idea of what was going on. He told me he was a minister. I guess he told me that because he knew I was a minister, because everybody in their department knew I was. And when he was glad that he got transferred to me. So, but when I first met him, I said we needed to meet so we could get to know each other. Let's see what your expectations are. I'll tell you what my expectations are. He was a clerk that reported to me. So I let him know what I needed. I told him I needed him to take notes. I needed him to make copies. I needed him to keep everything in order. And he looked at me and he said, well, I need you to know I'm not making any copies. He said, because when you start making one copy, it starts to take on a spirit, which I didn't understand, the spirit of the copy machine. But anyway, it helped me to understand why things weren't going his way. He was blaming God and everybody else for why things weren't going his way, but he was refusing to do what he was expected to do in order to get paid. In all of our lives, there are going to be, that was funny, but it's the truth is that in all of our lives, there are going to be unwanted occurrences, things that we don't want, things that we don't like, and there are going to be things that we really don't deserve. And there's really no good reason why those things happen. Nobody deserves illness or abuse or poverty. Nobody deserves to be oppressed or discriminated against. We don't have reasons for everything that does or does not happen. But it isn't because God is being a mean lover in our lives. Conversely, just because we're blessed in many ways doesn't mean God is being a good lover and loves us more than God loves anybody else. Maybe the answer to theodicy, why does or doesn't God make or allow things to happen, maybe the answer is, maybe that's just not how God is. Maybe that's just not what God's business is. Maybe that's not what God's about. Even in the story of Job, I only read the passages where it talked about who Job was, the type of person he was, and then I read the passage about what happened to him. I left out that whole middle piece about the deal that God made with Satan about, this person will curse you if you take away what's good for him. I left that out because Job didn't know about that even happening in the story. There was nothing in the story that said Job knew that this deal was made between God and Satan. Job was just living his life and things were going wrong and things weren't going right. And so isn't that how our life is? Things just happen. Things, we don't really know why things happen. Sometimes things are just bad. Sometimes things are just good. The message isn't, is God a good lover or a bad lover of our soul? The lesson is that there's no answer to why things happen. There's no divine, but there are lessons that we can learn even out of the worst of times. There are a few things we can even learn from reading this book of Job. Number one, we can be honest with God about how we're feeling. Because contrary to what some people say about this patience of Job, if you read the story of Job, you'll see that Job was not patient at all. He wasn't patient to his friends. He was not patient with God. He was honest with them. He said to his friends, what sorry comforters you are. He said to God, you're just unfair. He asked God, would you just leave human beings alone? And he asked God, could you just hide me away until all this misfortune has ended? And then number two, when Job lost everything, he took that opportunity to learn empathy and concerned for the destitute, because he had never been destitute. He had never been in such a bad situation, but he took this opportunity. He took his bad situation as a time for him to look around and see, who else have I not seen? What have I not been paying attention to because of the situation that I was in? It wasn't until I became broken down that I realized that there are people who live this way all the time. And what can I do to make a difference? And number 3, Job expanded his own theological understanding because he questioned the conventional wisdom of his day, because the conventional wisdom was, you must have sinned, you must have done something wrong. You can either curse God and die, or you can just be mad about it. But he expanded his theological understanding because of the situation wherein he found himself. Because he knew himself in the situation. He knew his feelings about God in the situation. That was the same thing many of us know, especially those of us who are people of color and those of us who are women. We know what it's like to be told who we are in a situation, that you're not good enough to be in leadership, that you're not supposed to preach or be in a position of leadership in the church or in society. Last week, I was reminded of this as I watched Henry Louis Gates' documentary on the Black church. You know, I was originally ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I've even been a guest preacher at Mother Bethel, which was the first church of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Yet, I had to make a decision if I would be true to my call and true to myself, or remain in the church in which I was raised. Because although the church leadership told me I was ahead of my time, and because I was being honest about who I was in terms of my sexual orientation, I still was told I could not be fully me and continue to be AME. You know, I was the one who knew theologically that I was called to do some work for justice and to share love via the life of the church, no matter what people around me believed. I was kind of like Job. I had people around me telling me I was an abomination, and I had to stand in my own truth, even though I spent nights fussing and complaining and crying to God about the situation. But still, I had to stand in my own truth. It doesn't matter what anybody else understands. What matters is what we understand and what we know. And it may cause us to expand our thinking beyond what our family thinks, what our world thinks. It doesn't have to be around sexual orientation. It can be about, being the youngest or being the oldest, or being female or being male. It doesn't matter. If God called and created you to do something, stand in your truth, like Job stood there in his truth. And it didn't matter what he understood and did or didn't understand. What he did know was he was still in a relationship with a God that loved him. There are times in life, like what happened to Job, things just don't make sense. Sometimes things seem unfair or unjust. It's during those times that we need to hold firm to our own faith and our own convictions, and recognize that instead of a God who is two lovers created in our image, one who helps and one who hurts, we are actually created in the image of one God who is love, a love that is with us in whatever circumstance we find ourselves. We have no promise that life is going to be easy, but we have the presence of a power that can bring joy into our lives, even when there seems like there's nothing to smile about. I'm glad today that we don't need two lovers. Our souls are filled with one love of one God that connects all humanity. We can be like Job and stand firm in that love, no matter what we're going through, no matter what anybody else says, no matter who believes it, no matter who understands it. A real relationship, that's what we can have with this one God, not two lovers, one lover, one God, a real relationship where we can fuss if we need to, we can praise if we want to, but we need to hang on to it always. Thank you for listening.